lawyers, counsellors, and they started with a few boards to kind of explain the story of Bloody Sunday, and members of the public would come in to just see the boards and look at some of the items that they were exhibiting. And then from there, it kind of grew into a museum, and they bought over a building. What year was it? 2000 and...
Not exactly sure.
I think it's like 2002. No, they bought over this very dilapidated building that had been 3 old age pensioners' flats, kind of one-story flats, that were actually on the site where Bloody Sunday had occurred. The thing about Bloody Sunday that maybe a lot of people don't know is the size of the area where it happened was actually very small. It was quite a concentrated area, just a residential area in a site known as the Bog Side. It's still kind of a working class residential area today. So a lot of the murders happened where the car park for the museum would be today. 1 or 2 actually, because the boundaries have changed of the building inside where the museum would be today. And there's a building inside where the museum would be today.
Sorry.
And there's a building outside. There's a little monument across the street, but that building, was just in really bad shape. So that was knocked down, and in 2017, brand new state-of-the-art museum was opened. So we've been in that site since then, and we get visitors from all over the world. We get lots of school groups in, and our mission is basically to educate people and to continue to tell the story of Bloody Sunday, and other massacres around the world as well.
Well done, Kira, well done. Okay, folks, how long do I have? Just have a few flights here. I'm very honoured to be part of this and to eventually get here to Detroit. Word struggle, one word, one struggle. It was our theme for the 50-year anniversary of what is now internationally known as Bloody Sunday. The similarities, obviously, between ourselves, maybe the older generations before me, as we took to the streets initially in the late 60s. And like yourselves here, people come onto the streets not because it's a good thing to do. It's a last resort that people will come onto the streets to protest. And if governments don't like what you're doing, then they're going to try and stop you. So really, the reaction of the people, especially in Derry in 1968, was a culmination of years and years of discrimination. The discrimination was obviously against the Catholic community mainly, in the form of employment rights. If you were Catholic, you were second class straight away. Even in the Catholic city with a heavy population of Catholics in the city of Derry, where I was born and grew up. The voting rights, the gerrymandering of the electoral boundaries to ensure we never get a chance electorally, and the education system. So when I was born, 64, 8 years later, became known as Bloody Sunday. My dad, one of the 13 victims of the day. So the first march in Derry, October the 5th, 68, was a small occasion of about 300 people. And the state and the government of the day sent in the police to stop the march. And they did, with violence. So the answer to peaceful protests at the time in Derry was state violence. And the answer from the people of Derry and around the north in general was they come out en masse and protest again peacefully. So in Derry, obviously, there's a series of events which led up then to the massacre. We had sort of the introduction of the British Army, the breakdown of communications between the Army and the Catholic communities, then the rebirth, if you like, of the IRA. So from peaceful protests, it turned into a war or a conflict. No, not everybody got involved in a war or conflict, but people still were out for basic human civil rights. Now, the Civil Rights Association or movement, that's what they were. And again labelled by the Unionist government and the Tory British government as subversives and United Irelanders and all this sort of stuff, all this sort of creating sort of confusion and whatever else. But they weren't, they were out for social and economic rights. Now the Bloody Sunday March was a civil rights march organised not by Irish Republicans and very much supported by the Catholic Church, believe it or not, because there was 8 Catholic priests, some who became heroes on Bloody Sunday on the march. Now, what Bloody Sunday was a Unionist and the British government's answer not only to peaceful protest, but to Free Derry. Because Free Derry was created a few years before that, where the barricades were in that area, and where I lived, so the British Army, the police and later the British Army, found it very difficult or unwilling to come into these areas. So the Unionist government needed this to end. The business community in Derry, believe it or not, were also asking the higher echelons of the British Army to come and sort it out. And so when they sent, on a Sunday morning, 50 years ago, they sent in a so-called crack unit of soldiers from Belfast, not from Derry, never in Derry before, and with a history around the world of mayhem and murder. And the previous August, they had murdered the 11 people in an area, Catholic area called Ballymurphy. So when the parachute regiment came into Derry, if they hadn't been told they go into the city, rough up a few people, batter a few people, and arrest a few people, that's what they would have done. But they didn't. They came in and acted with impunity, knowing they would be protected, knowing that they could get away with doing what they were doing. Because when they did it, over a period of minutes, they did it in broad daylight, without a thought about the media, nearly of the Western world who were watching this big occasion, without a thought of really what might be the consequences. Because when they were through and had murdered 13 people, my dad, God rest him, being the 12th victim of the day, they were through back to barracks. Then the classic British Army attitudes will cover it up. Not only did they cover it up that night, the guy who led the invasion of Iraq in 2003, now known as a retired General Sir Mike Jackson, was a soldier who officiated over the cover-up that night. So every British embassy in the world the next morning got a document, because he interviewed the soldiers and told them what they say. And I shot a gunman, sir, I shot a nail bomber, I shot a pepper bomber. When they knew from that morning they were going to do this, and they felt that this would be their day and they would be protected, and they were. So by noon the next day, or certainly by tea time the next day, that message was around the world. 108 shots, 26 targets, 13 murdered, 13 wounded, and 22 British soldiers, never in this city before. So if they come in there to identify ringleaders and shoot them, they wouldn't have known them, because they were never in our city. So think about that alone. So, and the message on that document was simple. That's the answer to any questions that will come up about what happened in Derry yesterday. So somebody said in Derry, lies were around the world before truth got its boots on in Derry. The next thing we knew, the British Prime Minister today, Edward Heath, orders an inquiry. So, and when we get more time, or we get into more, we'll discuss, I mean, the Unionist government, the British government, the British military, we're all having powwows and meetings in the lead up to Bloody Sunday. In fact, on Friday morning before Bloody Sunday, Edward Heath's cabinet met in Downing Street to discuss the next couple of days. So we're not sure exactly what the words, because when Edward Heath was asked to come to the second inquiry, he lost his memory. So on a Tuesday morning, Edward Heath summons the Lord Chief Justice. Now, it was my 8th birthday. My dad's still lying in his coffin at home. And then they order an inquiry. And Edward Heath tells the Lord Chief Justice Widgery, remember, Lord Widgery in Northern Ireland, when you're doing this inquiry, we are fighting a military war over there, but we're also fighting a propaganda war. So it's very important. And the words he said back, do not worry about it, sir. I will stack up the forensic evidence against the deceased. That's a document that we found 21 years later in the Public Records Office in Kew Gardens in London. So Mr. Woodry, Lord Chief Justice of this so-called great legal system posted around the world for what they achieved, and they really didn't achieve nothing. He refused evidence from witnesses at very close quarter. Not only were the media taking and recording photographs and recordings of the day, every death was witnessed by hundreds of people because it was a culmination of this march. So in one example, Dr. Regan McClay, a GP on duty on the day, God rest him, he's dead, a former British soldier, actually, he had a document that was that thick, and he gave it to the inquiry. Of course, he didn't want to hear him. He wouldn't actually hear audio recordings of the British Army conversations on the day, recorded by a Derry man. He wouldn't hear evidence from some British paratroopers soldiers who wanted to tell the truth. And he just, what we call it, the witchery, whitewash. Yeah. He washed whiter than soap butter, as we said at Derry at the time. So the Witchery Tribunal report is delivered to the Houses of Parliament in April '72. The British Parliament debated and accepted in the totality the findings of the 60 pages of outright lie. So therefore, under the legal terms, I can't exactly recall what they were, but under the Tribunals of Evidence Act, you cannot have a second inquiry because that's the legal finding and it's voted upon by the Parliament. So therefore, that's it. It's done and it's over. And if they had have expected that people would go away and not come back to the streets more and more, they very much were very, very much mistaken. Because the tsunami of anger that came out of them graves, they had 13 graves. And what Bloody Sunday actually did to people in Derry and people around Ireland and certainly the Western world was legitimised violence. If the state can do it to us, well, we can do it back. And that's sort of a very simple term for what it's worth. So the place did go bananas for many, many, many years, and too many people died. Not just because of Bloody Sunday, but certainly because of a lot of tragedies and atrocities and lies that were told around that time. And after that, well, state killings went on and on and on, and the lies and the collusion went on and on and on. So 20 years later, I would not even spoke a word to each other in our family about Bloody Sunday. We started a new campaign for justice. The brother Tony, who you met, obviously was leading light, having served time in prison as a political prisoner. So to go on all day about the 6 or 7 years of the campaign for justice, we were lucky. We had the Good Friday Agreement. Like our old Blair, he agreed, after being coerced a lot by Mark McGuinness, actually, they ordered a second fresh inquiry into these events. So Blair appointed a British judge called Lord Travel, a Canadian judge, and an Australian judge, who actually died in British. It actually was a Commonwealth inquiry that we wanted. So anyway, it was up in the year 1998. If we believe one of the longest, if not the longest, ever opening statement anywhere in the world, lasting 42 days, speaking 2 million words. Christopher hearing nearly 1,000 witnesses. 1 year in London, the families and everybody else was forced to relocate to London for the protection of the soldiers who did it, and whoever else. So down in the Central Hall of Westminster for 1 year, we witnessed soldier after soldier after soldier, politicians, generals, civil servants, police officers, some screamed, some not screamed, and they were struck down by this virus called collective amnesia, where they couldn't remember anything about this particular day. Soldier F, for example, they killed my dad, they killed Barney McWickham, they killed Michael Kelly, they killed Jim Ray, and he murdered Willie McKinney and probably wounded about 5. His best friend was Soldier T, who passed away, we believe. Maybe he said natural causes, but unlikely he let it die somewhere in Angola or one mercenary, because a lot of them did as well. So he swore in the Bible, and then he proceeded to tell lies for the 2 days or 3 days he was in the box. They said they couldn't remember coming, couldn't remember leaving. So these soldiers were intrigued and angry about now serving their country for so many years and now having to come back and face charges for something that they were told they want to do. So therefore, we were expecting the Savile report, they report back, and within a month or 2 months or a year, and it reported back within 5 years, producing a report of 5,000 pages. And the report basically is a very carefully crafted report in the wording and the conclusions of the report. Because when the Widgery Tribunal reported back in 72, Widgery didn't even tell people, well, he killed your dad or he killed who. There was nothing known that. It was just, and actually what Lord Widgery actually said in his words, that the media or people across the Atlantic might cling on to, like evidence supplied, evidence given by soldiers of support company of the parachute regiment was the most convincing evidence I have ever heard. Now that's words that you will sort of oh, right. And not only was that the case, the next insult to injury was medals of honour. We decorated the commanders and whatever else cover up because of Robert Ford or to the crown and to the country and whatever else. But as I said, Savile left no stone unturned. If you had been a fly on the wall on the backside, he would nearly have found it because he was very, very meticulous in his efforts. The most important thing about this report was the innocence of every person who lost their lives on this day. And he left no doubt about the innocence of every person killed or wounded on this day. And he condemned the soldiers who did it. They acted without fear, they acted without panic, and they did what they did. And they shot people who were running, crawling, as my dad was, or going to the help of others as they were murdered. But then when you come to the conclusions about the commanders who went in and the politicians who sent them in, he seems to just not scared over it, but he exonerated them, he protected them, criticised them sort of mildly on the report, but the main bulk of the main blame for Bloody Sunday was one undisciplined commander, or one or two undisciplined commanders and a group of soldiers, but we know this was state sanctioned and ordered terror, and that's what it was. Now even think about this. In September, well, Cameron said sorry and all the rest, but part of Cameron's speech was this is shocking conclusions they have to read and blah 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 blah. And then he goes, on behalf of the government, on behalf of the country, I'm deeply sorry. But then he goes on to say, anyone looking for evidence, a plan, or a cover-up will find it nowhere in the report. And then he goes on to say, this type of inquiry will never ever happen again. He criticised the length of the inquiry and the cost of £200 million of the inquiry. But what he really said, we were caught. But then they do in the streets, but then they Edward Heath's government. We can't do this again. So human rights lawyers like Pat Finnegan and others may or may not get the justice, probably won't get the justice that we got because of that. Also goes into Maggie Thatcher, into Downing Street, the sanction of this operation to murder the human rights lawyers and others as well. But back to September 72, inquest into Bloody Sunday, and his inquest delivered a verdict 6 months after the Widgery Tribunal disgraceful report, and the verdict was simple. Why then did the British government not go, well, when we investigate this again, no, just sweep it under the carpet. And one of our demands, folks, was a repudiation of the Widgery findings and the Widgery Tribunal report. We got it in a way where you wouldn't know we got it because nobody mentioned it. It was just floated from the annals of history forever, convenient, the annals of history forever, convenient, clearly what his remit would be. Whitewash the whole lot, lie about the people who died, and the people of Derry, the people of Ireland, was just something going on with their lives. Folks, but the Bloody Sunday families, myself included, took on the might of the British Empire, and we exposed them for the murder and for their lives and for the deceit that they did to our families. They underestimated the determination, intelligence, Maybe the good looks as well, I don't know about that. So, but they did, and we forced that apology, like apologies for any of the 100 countries that have been in the world. And there always will be was along with the hunger striker Joe McDonald, and you dare to call me a terrorist when you look down your mum and this young man died at 30 years of age on hunger strike 9 years after Bloody Sunday. Folks, I could go on all day, but as I said, Bloody Sunday now is one event of many events. I'm now involved in tour guiding around the bogside, telling people the real stories, not this sort of Mickey Mouse or Disney version of what happened here. Real, true, as if it was an ordinary day in Aden or Cyprus or Malaya, around the world, just do it. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, we want to open up for questions and discussion. And first of all, I just wanted to once again thank you for coming. And of course, this is very important on the 50th anniversary of this tragic massacre. Totally unnecessary what happened at that time. I'm glad you went through the whole history of how this was covered up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 1972, that's 50 years ago.
Yeah.
They did a preliminary report which resolved them, and then, of course, later, how many years later was it that they did the more extensive report?
Well,
was it in the 90s?
Yeah, it was began in 1988. You're talking 26 years later, and reported 38 and a half years later.
Yeah, and it took them, what, another 16 years to finish this report?
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Mm-hmm.
And then they still come out and say, well, we don't know actually exactly who was responsible for this.
Well, they did pinpoint all the soldiers and what they did, but
Okay.
still protected. I mean, Jackson was a guy who laid out by Ballymurphy, the massacre, and Bloody Sunday. See, what they do then is handpick one of their own, Colonel Derry Bulford, who wanted to blame him for everything. So he never rose one rank from Lieutenant Colonel, where Jackson and ours went straight up to the top of the league, because of whatever. No, that's just what they do. But they did underestimate the families as well. So it's very important that, we get some lawyers here coming on board with us and trying to sort of say, we'll do it this way, we'll do it that way, we'll do it the other way. And I've seen some lawyers get sacked, actually because the families owned it.
Right.
We not owned it in general. I mean, you need your lawyers, you need your legal teams, but they certainly were told in no uncertain terms, you take your guidance and your lead from us. And it was very important because we sort of not owned it, but we were the people who dared to take them on, take them on, and we did a very decent job. I think on the 50th anniversary, stuff was amazing. It was totally
David and then Charles.
Two questions. With that apology, did they ever offer compensation to the victims? And the second question, could you comment on the status of the civil rights movement or civil rights in Northern Ireland currently?
Well, first of all, there was recently compensation cases settled, but in fairness to I'm not going to go into but certainly what people got was very nicely compared to what they should have got. But saying that, I don't really comment on the compensation thing. It's a sort of, they did give compensation, but I think it's a private sort of matter that who did what and who didn't do what. But if you were wounded, you would get far more than the deceased, because some of the deceased families, because they were children, they weren't really worth any value. And that's the way it's to the British, not to us, but the British, And certainly the families of the parents who were murdered got no compensation. What they really got was the estimated pay packet for the next so many years. They don't. And they actually employed a very right-wing unionist lawyer to fight for every penny that people actually got as well. Civil rights movement went out of fashion after Bloody Sunday. Not out of fashion, but peaceful protest was gone. And after that, they just sort of went out of, dissolved really after Bloody Sunday, because but today there's a lot of human rights organisations like the Pat Finucane Centre run by Ciara's dad, Paul O'Connor, and other human rights organisations who really are still fighting for justice for the people mainly victims of state violence and state cover-up as well. So although the civil rights movement doesn't really exist anymore, there are many human rights cases still being fought for by ordinary people as well. And that will keep on. And again, I mean, the British right-wing media, who never liked us, and obviously we never liked them as well, and the right-wing Tory politicians. And if you go on to YouTube and type on Soldier F debate, you'll see all these guys standing up in the Houses of Parliament going, well, I served 4 tours of duty in Northern Ireland and I got a medal for bravery, and how dare they don't put us in the same light as a terrorist and all the crack. And this poor soldier, after 50 years, is now being charged. And the answer to that question is simple. Yes, it is 50 years. But that's how long they denied justice to the people. 50 years of lies, of deceit and cover-up as well. So, and what the word of the British media will latch on to is witch hunt. It's not a witch hunt. It's because we were always denied justice. And they would rather we went away, cover it up, just put the covers over our heads and forget about it. The reaction in England to Soldier F been charged. When this guy's a mass murderer, he could mention the dispatches for Ballymurphy. He also went on to murder one of 2 Protestants on the Shankill Road in Belfast and lied about that as well. And then we believe he was elevated into the Special Air Service for 14 years. So the first thing that I think it was a Home Secretary at the time, the Defence Secretary, said when Soldier F was facing charges in 2019, we will do everything we can to protect this soldier. And know the most important thing is, which as well, a very important thing is, they never mentioned the victims. Our soldiers were fighting a war, fighting the IRA, and they were, but taking advantage of that situation, like all our countries around the world, they murder people. Iraq, Afghanistan, murder people with impunity, cover up. And that's a fact. So when my brother Tony made that speech outside the Guildhall in 2010, our truth stands for the truth for people around the world who were also victims of unaccountable murder and daily state murder as well. So the answer to that question, the human rights debate, the human rights stories are going on. People are still looking for inquests, people are still looking for truth and justice, and they have every right to do that. You know, people will say about living in the past, but we don't live in the past. We live in a real world. We were denied justice, and by God, we're going to keep going until we get justice for everybody. And see, if we don't get it, this generation will get it, you know, and they certainly will.
Can I comment on the second question, actually? So, in answer to your question about the civil rights movement today, obviously the Museum of Free Derry, it's like dedicated to Bloody Sunday, but it kind of looks at the Free Derry period. So, the civil rights movement at the time. I suppose, like here in the US and in Detroit, have Black Lives Matter is sort of it's what the civil rights movement has evolved into. I suppose that's where the struggles kind of differ, because obviously the Unionist state wasn't discriminated against Catholics on the basis of race. Really, I mean, obviously was the sort of native Irish population who identified as Irish and rejected the British state. It's sort of different, because I think the civil rights movement largely did achieve their demands, because it is in terms of voting and housing. They did that, because, and again, it was at a heavy price as well, And today, where we are today, I mean, obviously we don't have a government because of the Unionists pulling it back to again. So, but certainly Kira's generation now will probably feel a sense of justice, not only because it's the American situation was your colour of your skin, whatever, for many years now. It still is. Well. Like, I know that I'm not discriminated against as a young Irish woman living in the north of Ireland. There's certain things where, for example, we don't have an Irish Language Act, so I think the Irish identity in the north of Ireland, maybe it's not quite on the same level, but that's about culture as well. But, in that sense, nobody's gonna, or it's very, very unlikely that someone would see my name, say, oh, that's likely an Irish Catholic, that's a nationalist, and, for example, refuse to employ me. Or, I've never suffered from police violence. So I think that that's where in America the struggle is still so going, and we were hearing earlier about how that struggle is still very much alive. I think like the sort of Northern Irish civil rights movement in that sense doesn't exist in the same way, but there's still like a thriving activist spirit, and Derry especially, lots of activism around like women's rights, like workers' rights, sort of poverty, LGBTQ plus rights. I think that's maybe those are that's the modern day.
It's different sort of in era.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Did anybody ever believe in Ireland, not just Northern, but the Republic of Ireland, that they'd ever have the women's rights, reproductive rights, and same-sex marriage and so? They have a very, 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 very conservative country for years and years. So as I say, the younger people now, again, Nelson Mandela says as well, let their education use that as your weapon. Because the young people, including my daughter, who's a friend of hers, obviously have got their educations. I have struggled 16 with no education at all. Not that I could have, but I just wanted to get in the streets, I remember it, But that's it, so, but, certainly, I mean, the achievements of the civil rights movements have fairly been met. That's when nobody will ever get away with discriminating, although that might happen in certain quarters and certain things. But certainly, I mean, that's why, as an Irish Republican, and a lot of people had to swallow a very hard pill when Irish Republicans went into government with unionists. And it's simple, get on with them. Don't allow them to dictate what they did before, because they did that. I mean, they gerrymandered us, they gave us very, very little. So when you see a guy of the stature of Mark McGuinness, for example, get in the government with Ian Paisley, unionists didn't like that. And I thought it was great, because I was there that day. Because that, to me, that was history, for one sense that it will never be the same again. So when you drive from Belfast to Derry now, when you get back over, you'll get to see great roads. And again, Mark McGuinness was, God rest him, to the forefront of getting Derry infrastructure. Because we only developed Derry into the great city, a very modern city, and attract the investment, you need infrastructure. In the 60s, we had 4 railway networks in Derry, now we have 1. We have an airport that's that small. One of the pilots for Ryanair actually landed in an airfield in Ballykelly up the road from it, thinking they've landed in an airport, So maybe Belfast has 3 very thriving airports as well. So there's still a job of ongoing to really bring Derry into the sort of same cusp as like Belfast and Dublin or Cork. But we will achieve it, but it's an ongoing process, and we have to keep going, That's what we do, we just keep going. Just get up every morning and wind it up like a wee toy and just keep going round and round and round. We don't stop, That's what we do.
What else is there to do?
Derry?
Yeah.
Charles?
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to everybody who had sent condolences to me in the death of my wife. All the love and the prayers and the condolences generally. I want to thank all of you for the support. Now, just before COVID, the year before COVID, my wife and I went to, we were invited by the Museum of Free Derry and the Bloody Sunday Trust to go and visit there and tour. Very rich experience there. And we went to the museum itself was striking because it has content about our struggle in the United States against all the injustices that we know about. And it was also very striking to see the similarities of injustice, the struggle against injustice. Of course, there are differences, but we looked at the human suffering that ordinary people experience and compared it to the modern times, the police brutality in the United States. They had an exhibit. They had collected shoes from a number of the people who had been assassinated and brutalized by the police. They had shoes on the floor of the deceased. And it made me think of all of the people in the United States, all of the who have suffered from the police brutality over the centuries. That is something that we can do. We were thinking about, what we can do, because as Paul pointed out, the struggle is also against propaganda and the lies in the media. And that is one way of breaking through that wall of lies. And it was something very simple and very captivating, because we know who stood in those shoes. And we know the suffering of the mothers and the fathers and the siblings and the children of each individual who was slain and brutalized here as well as there. And so it was something, it was a very moving experience. My wife was focused also on the struggle of the women, the personal struggles in their families that they had to endure when their loved one was killed by the military, the British military. And there were similarities, I think, about how Ireland was the first of the British colonies, and then went on to colonize much of the world, including North America. So we have a lot in common. The differences I don't think are that important. Is that human beings are struggling to have a decent life, just to be treated as human beings, and the fullness of that sense. And so we're grateful to you, Paul and Fiera, and the others, Maeve. I can't remember all the names, but there was just a outpouring of love to us. And we deeply appreciate that, and hope that we can also continue to internationalize our struggle here in Detroit.
Yes.
No matter what particular branch of the struggle you're involved in. To show that we need today to focus on the unity among us, and the unity between us and the peoples of the other countries that are experiencing these same injustices, whatever names or labels we apply to them. It's the spirit of fighting for justice that unites us and make us like one family. So I want to thank you again for the hospitality.
Great. It's good to be here. It's good to just to be among friends as well, and people who've suffered the same as myself, because I know what it's like to be a victim. I know, and obviously they have to sort of live with that, and then when they come to have a certain period in life and they learn, hold on, I'm not in. We can no longer just keep ourselves as victims. We've got to be campaigners. We've got to be out leading the charge in terms of getting justice for not only for Bloody Sunday, but for all victims of murder, and certainly state murder as well. And the similarities here with the police force that we had for many years, and where people obviously from a certain religion would have joined, because you can beat or torture or kill with impunity. The George Floyd thing was just, I was going to say unreal. It was not really unreal, but shocked the world to see how this guy felt he was going to get killed with murder. George Floyd, when he was shouting, I can't breathe. You've been in Derry, classic movie, but classic victims. Children denied, the families denied justice, the protection of the forces and the soldiers as well. And that's the main ultimate game of it. Soldiers, I've had a lot of soldiers over the years, and some of them wouldn't have never understood why they were here. But of the caliber of these armed, uniformed thugs and terrorists, they certainly knew the job they were here to do, because they had this experience around the world, and they created around that world as well. It's this sort of culture of ignorance and tolerance and sort of blind eye as well. And instead of if they believe Bloody Sunday was as well, and instead of if they believe, forget about it, well, they were wrong. And I remember knocking doors of victims who were wounded, they were raw. It's still good to go back and sort of re-traumatize yourself up. And when people realize the importance of the lie that was told about the victims of Bloody Sunday, and about how important it was that we should do this. Like, people from Derry were very not skeptical, but they still had that belief that we could achieve this, And luckily, not luckily, it's the wrong word to use it. We had people, John gave us the support that we needed at the time, but and the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement was going on as well. So we were lucky in that sense that we had that, But and again, with the families of the deceased having to get up off their behinds and went right, it would never have changed. Still, everybody knew the truth anyway, but the word had to be told the truth. And the three judges who delivered that clearly with the splash, whatever, and tell the story all these years again. It was very important, and we've always appreciated and respected the people of Derry for their. And again, it gives people around the world hope. Sometimes you really sort of disbelieve yourself. Did we really achieve this? Or not what did we achieve? It's only when you meet people from around the world who have achieved something incredible. As I say, they underestimated it. We weren't sort of injustices every day, no mechanisms to sort of try and prove otherwise, But we were sort of European, we were savvy, we were media savvy, legal savvy, where a lot of people maybe around the world in the underdeveloped countries with the British world don't really have that sort of whatever. So in a sense, we sort of, as I said, we took on the might of the British Empire, and when they forced a Tory Empire, and when they forced a Tory Cameron to make a statesman-like apology, something achievable. So that if you want change to happen, you have to go out and look for change to happen. You can't sit back and think it's going to come to you, because it never will. So that's where we were. So, but we'll just keep going. Derry, yourself, you were there, and yourself. So we're a great community. We don't sort of look back and go, here. No, we're celebrating the city. We're a bright city. We're a very intelligent city, and it's a very happy city to be in. But and even 38 and a half years after Bloody Sunday, you can nearly feel the sense of the clouds were lifting. The dark clouds were lifting a wee bit off us, And now you see the 9 years ago state of culture. And a friend of mine who lost his dad in a struggle said to me, "Oh, wouldn't it be great to bring him back for one day, just to see what we have achieved?" And it's very important, because when you see the children beside me here, moving, listening to Bruno Mars and the big open space in the former British Army base, on them dancing and singing, and Bruno Mars and everyone else singing all these great songs and celebratory. And it always reminded me of the great man himself, Bobby Sands, the hunger striker, who said, let our revenge be the laughter of our children. And that's very, very important as well. So, what do you think, Kira?
I agree.
Right. Yeah.
What like movies or documentaries would you recommend for, say, an American who wants to know about the history of the Bloody Sunday incident?
Yeah.
There's one movie I saw called 71, which was about called Trial, and there was one movie called Bloody Sunday, which was originally made 2002, and there's a movie Belfast. So which one would you recommend that people watch really to get a sense of the troubles and the issues around Bloody Sunday like for Americans?
I haven't watched Belfast, but obviously, so I can't really make a judgment on it. But some people have watched it. It's a good entertaining movie, but it's not really the real sort of stuff. In documentary wise, you're talking on YouTube, loads of stuff. There were two great documentaries before the event before Bloody Sunday, the Battle of the Bauxite, it's about 1 hour, and the story of Free Derry, which is about 1 hour as well. And they're great documentaries. There's also a guy called, a British journalist who's been here for 50 years, or in Ireland, for reporting in Derry in Ireland for 50 years, Peter Taylor. So Peter Taylor stuff's worth the watching as well. And he's interviewed the pilots, he's interviewed the commanders, right up and again. What he actually said to me about 3 years ago when he came back for the whatever it was, he's interviewed some of these soldiers who are now unwell and they're of a certain age, and most of them have convinced themselves that this didn't happen, like they told the lie about the gun battles and all this here. So again, that's maybe another thing, but YouTube has got loads and loads of stuff about Bloody Sunday, the Troubles, the hunger strike, the blanket protest, you name it. And the Troubles is not a word I really feel comfortable using. Troubles is not really. Troubles like waking up in the morning, no money out to spend. A lot of Bauxite in there at that time stood up to the might of the army and the police and the state and whatever else. And they were the people who fought for the future of me and the next generations as well.
And then another, a good sort of film directly about governance, that's quite a good one. So, you know,
We
if you
can-
wanted to.
We can get all the stuff wrote down for you as
Yeah,
well.
and that's a good one. And then there was another Bloody Sunday film that was the same year, and that one was directed by Paul Greengrass.
So what other Sunday one?
That
I
was
prefer the docudrama with,
the Sunday,
The Sunday
Jimmy McGovern one is like generally seen as the sort of better one.
the whole reason for that as well, because Jimmy McGovern had been here and was researching for maybe a couple of years all the stuff from the families and chatting them, and as the thing was about maybe not released, but more or less, and our budget came out from independent television, ITV, with the same story in the same week, where we this one was ready to sort of go, and people sort of felt a wee bit uneasy about the multi-millionaires or multi-million business coming and making the same movie about the multi-millionaires or multi-million business coming and making the same movie. A more same story, but my own preference is because Jimmy McGovern, a guy from Liverpool, he did all the Hillsborough stuff as well. Great man, and a man who genuinely cared, you know, but the other ones weren't as much as, that's what my opinion anyway. So Sunday, Jimmy McGovern, we can write all this stuff down, or we can send it to you, Kate.
One of them is an Alex Gibney film. He's an American filmmaker. He did the Scientology documentary that was on HBO, but that one is called No Stone Unturned. Both of these came out within the past couple of years, and there's another one called Unquiet Graves, which is a Belfast-based filmmaker named Sean Burley. So those would be really good at understanding sort of like the context that Paul's talking about in terms of impunity and state violence and the cover-ups.
Also the one that which is covered that as well with the cover-up and the collusion, the Miami show band.
Yeah.
They were a show band from both sides of the border. They played all around the place, and then a couple of them were murdered. And you get to talk all day about it here, but you better go on YouTube or type in Miami show band massacre, and you see the British Army involvement in this as well, on the lies and not only that, the lack of investigations as well. You know, where the police didn't really want to. I mean, Bloody Sunday and Ballymurphy, there were never a police investigation. The British Army were allowed to investigate themselves. That's what they did.
The point that I wanted to bring out,
Yeah,
which you made, the connection, the state violence,
yeah,
and even in this country,
yeah.
it's never concluded as being just that.
Mhm.
But it's not. It is in one sense, like you say, for the family, but in terms of the state accepting responsibility, because
Yeah,
this is,
of course.
you know, so, and it's the same thing what you're saying, the connection is to the state violence.
Yeah.
And how we as a people internationally
Yeah.
can bring light on that.
Mm-hmm. And it's just about having the mechanism to expose not each individual case, because for thousands of cases, but the state in general, and it's a big country here. Man, again, the cover-ups are allowed time after time for centuries. When you watch some of the stuff of the civil rights, the 50s, the 40s, and 30s, you know, it's just blatant discrimination, racism, and it's just blatant loss. I still can't get into the mindsets of the people who did it here as well, because you couldn't treat other people the way the blacks were treated in the States. You know, you just couldn't get into their mind, like, because of the colour of their skin or ethnicity, or because they no longer were going to be slaves as well. It was great to see that where we are today, because again, if people had not rebelled and not gone to the streets to protest, I mean, it would never have been, especially the American civil rights, when they took on the Rosa Parks and stuff like that, the strike, the bus strike, and then obviously bringing to the Supreme Court, enforcing Supreme Court judges, they overturn stuff and they change.
Lieutenant Colonel Kitson and his relationship to the USA, bringing him to Puerto Rico to do the same.
Do you know about Kitson?
I don't know what Kitson. Do you know about Kitson?
First of all, the support for the different causes that we spoke about, I think was Palestine and somewhere else.
Black Lives Matter,
Yeah,
Palestine and Black Lives
We all
Matter.
support that. I mean, may all support that, and you should support it every way you can. But there's a debate about Free Derry Wall being graffitied upon, if you like, by different things, because then one group will do it. There's one last week about somebody being a rapist or a paedophile or something like that, you know. So we prefer that we support these causes, but we would prefer that the wall should remain the black and white wall it is, because it's very important for people around the world to see the actual wall the way it is. But certainly, the causes that you spoke about are very well documented, highlighted, and supported in the city of Derry. You know, Kitson obviously learned his trade in Malaya and in Kenya as well. He was there. He wrote a book called Low Intensity Operations, the Manual for Counterinsurgency. And I know from, your dad probably knows this as well, the British government have recently still been paying compensation to the people from the Kenyan, the Mau Mau fighters in Kenya and their families and all that, because with Kitson, I'm not an expert on it, read a book years ago, haven't read it in a while, but it's more or less what it's, and then claim it as loyalist actions. So to create create the confusion in the community of your enemy. So if 4 people are shot dead by the British Army civilians, and then the UDA or the UVF will claim responsibility, then the Catholics or the IRA might go and do whatever. No, that's creating a tit for tat, divide and conquer. And that's what they've done around the world. And again, the kid's still alive actually, he's about 90, he's living on a nursing home somewhere. Which anyway was, but anyway, it's an art story. But anyway, so Kitson was a so-called hard man in British Army circles. But he was a very smart, intelligent, uncaring soldier, and he served, he learned his trade in Malaya. And he said to him, you went, no, he says, what exactly did he say? He messed that up, or he balls that up, or whatever, and I said, why, sir, did I go too far? He says, no, you did not go far enough. That was his answer. Sunday Kitson was a very, very cruel enemy, if you like, and his mates. See the interrogations that was used in Guantanamo and all that as well. That happened 40, 50 years ago in Ireland as well. The same torture, the same stress positions, the same sensory deprivation and drugging people and all the rest. All used waterboarding, all used by Kitson's methods and so-called expertise. The means justify the ends. I mean, that's very similar to Guantanamo. That's all Kitson. You know, that was all his so-called expertise.
Daryl?
Well, yeah. I was going to ask you if you could share a little bit about what's going on in Ireland right now, because I'm sure before you leave here, you're going to get the opportunity to sit down with some folks and talk about what the heck is going on in this country and how folks are seeing and thinking about it. And the reason I'm asking is I was down your way about 4 months ago, but I was in Glasgow, Scotland for the COP26 UN meeting. And so I know when you get to Eastern Europe, it's a little different from here and stuff anyway. But African immigrants, folks that look like me, you know, they ain't living that great life over there in Scotland. So I can't say specifically about Ireland. Even myself, until I open my mouth and they hear, you know, how I talk from here, then they know I ain't from Haiti or some other places. And then they try to treat you like, oh, you're a nice one. But, you know, that's just bullshit. So I was just trying to get a sense of what's going on, because a lot of the economic stuff is the same. Like in Scotland, you got the right-wing crazy folks, and they being treated like they're really doing something. And then you got the left-wing folks that folks are trying to ignore, and some of them acting like they're crazy. And then you got the majority of the real people in the middle who are poor in the middle and are suffering, just trying to survive. Because this COVID mess, I mean, I sound like I'm crazy talking. that COVID stuff has changed the whole way that we live everywhere we go. And so over there, aside from bouncing around, and for those of you that do this kind of organizing and going around talking about stuff, you know, we travel to a whole lot of places and the people don't know what you did. They think you really went and saw something. But most of us go somewhere and we ended up in meetings and all kinds of other stuff, so we didn't really get to be in the community. So I was just wondering, what is it like over there?
I mean, in terms of, I think that Ireland is really starting to grapple with issues around racism, and I think for a long time you would hear, and still do, to be honest, you would hear a lot of Irish people saying, sure, we can't be racist, we were discriminated against ourselves, we're a former colony, and as our population is becoming more diverse, we've like a lot of new generation of Black Irish people and Irish people of colour, and we're starting to sort of grapple a bit more with the fact that racism, maybe before it was quite sort of latent and hidden, and it's kind of coming out a lot more. So, you know, we're definitely starting to have a lot more conversations about like race and racism in Ireland. As you said as well, Ireland is you know, a nice place to live. So we're getting a lot more immigration, which is great. With that, there's also been a growth in the far right with racism. I mean, there's a few years ago, there was settlement of refugees in a town quite near to Derry. It's in Donegal, so it's in the Republic, but it's like a half an hour away. And no, it's not Letterkenny. But they were going to set up sort of in the Republic. They have this system. It's called direct provision, where refugees and immigrants they're in Guildhall in the city centre. I haven't seen such a big protest in a long time. And we actually, funnily enough, did get fined. Lots of people got police fines because they were breaking COVID restrictions. And there was a lot of outrage because that protest in Derry, we were kind of organised all over Ireland, but that one in Derry was organised by Black people living in Derry, like Black people from Derry. And so organisers naturally were the first to arrive for the protest because they're organising the event. So the majority of people that were fined at this protest were Black, even though the majority of people who actually attended the protest were white, you know, because Derry still has kind of a majority white population. So there was a lot of outrage there, and the PSNI, which is the police force, came under a lot of criticism, and eventually they did reverse the fines, which was a great victory. But yes, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, we just wanted to get a sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
Because I did run into some of those issues. Except for when folks see these things, they more than African American, they be thinking, you know, Bob Marley, Rastafari. But I enjoyed intermingling with folks, and I only got to stop through Ireland on the way home. You know, I stopped in the airport. They put me on from one place to the other and sent me home. But thanks for coming in. I appreciate
you'll have to
you
come
sharing.
back to Ireland for public visit.
Paul, you have a question?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like a reflection because I'm American and Jamaican. You know, I have Commonwealth citizenship, so it's like interesting to hear some of the things about race and about progress and about like what you're actually struggling against. Because you know, I recall one time talking to somebody when I was living in Chicago who's from Ireland, from Galway, and someone said Northern Ireland, and they corrected me and said, you know, we were all dealing with Palestine. They said that's occupied Ireland. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was very radical. Just a position that you refuse to even, when you refuse to use the colonizing language. And I know that when there's like militant struggle, and a lot of times the way to negotiate out of that, which many people want the violence to stop, the losses to stop, but it almost like puts you in this compromised position where you begin to accept things about the colonization, about colonialism, accept certain boundaries. I wonder about the ongoing dialogue around that, around decolonization, because I know that conversation is about it. And the other thing that made me think of, because basically we're working on a timeline of Republican struggle this summer with a couple of conferences, and it made me think of this day in Jamaica we have called Bad Friday, which is a day in which Rastafarians, there was a lie about something that a Rastafarian did to somebody at the beach, and the result was the Jamaican police to go through the towns and villages and go to settlements and humiliate people, and cut people's beards, cut people's dreadlocks, rip their clothes off, beat them, so people got severely injured in that. And when you talk about whether or not, like we were talking about whether or not you're discriminated against, it made me think of that because the the way that colonialism works and white supremacy works, that we think that if you're light skinned, we understand that people are mistreated because they're dark skinned. Well, we think that the unspoken assumption is that, well, the people who are light skinned are not mistreated. And we know that that's not true. So I was wondering if there's still ongoing conversation about decolonization and colonialism, and whether or not any of that gets into thinking about, I don't want to go on, but just thinking about identity, thinking about what it means to have been made into British subjects. You talk about language laws, all of that.
That's actually a great question, because I did my dissertation at university on decolonization literature and like depictions of the North. But I think we have to acknowledge as well that discrimination in Ireland looks so different because it was white Europeans being discriminated against. So we weren't enslaved. We have faced discrimination in the same way. So there are definitely conversations constantly ongoing about decolonizing Ireland and Irish culture and questions of language and identity. I think it can be a really difficult issue for some people, because the problem is that we have a peace process and we're trying to move past sectarianism and trying to create a society where we live with people who identify as British and who are kind of sort of unionists living in the 6 counties, and they very much feel British, and so I think it's difficult sometimes, because when we talk about decolonization, they feel like it questions their identity and they feel like it's a threat to their existence. Some people recently celebrated the centenary of partition and the foundation of the state of Northern Ireland. And that to them is a great thing. I don't see that as a great thing. I think it's a tragedy that Ireland was partitioned, and obviously, I wish for a united Ireland. But it's a fine line, because I still want unionists to feel welcome, and I don't want a return to violence. I still I would hope that maybe they could become a protected minority in a united Ireland. It's no skin off my nose if they want to feel British and say that they're British. It's as long as I'm not forced to be British, then I don't mind if they want to be British. So I think that's a bit different, isn't it? Because obviously, take the Jamaican context, that was very much the British Empire going in and oppressing native Jamaicans. And I don't know, how many descendants of British colonizers live in Jamaica today.
Just non-black people, non-black American people, probably about 3%. But they're Portuguese and stuff. They're not necessarily.
So there are tiny minorities. I suppose it's different in that sense, isn't it? But I think in terms of us getting to a stage where Irish culture is respected, because there's still struggles around identity and culture. But I think decolonization is still really important. It's just it looks different in Ireland, is what I'm trying to say. I think we need to recognise that because we're Irish people and we have white European privilege, then that does look different for us. But we definitely, in terms of solidarity as well, with other places in Empire, links with India, links with Jamaica. I think it's kind of like a shared struggle in that sense, even as we recognise differences.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's a longer dialogue. But even around identifying as white, it begs its way back into history to understand where all Gaelic people come from, and sort of so it's just interesting. It's not about skin color; it's just about power.
Yeah.
So that's why I wonder if the ongoing, the ongoing conversation about it.
Yeah. Do you know who you would find really interesting? Is this Irish academic called Emma Dabbery, and she's based in SOAS, the university in London, but she's Black Irish, and she writes a lot about empire and wider questions of decolonization, and so she might be interesting. Emma Dabbery, if you haven't heard of her, definitely look her up. She's written some great books.
Can I ask a quick question? Dabbery, D-A-B-E-R?
D-A-B-I-R-I. D-A-B-I-R. I'm giving you guys more back, so okay. Yeah, we'll just, we'll
So we
write
have-
it. Oh, it's Sharon.
We got two other questions, Sharon and David.
Sharon?
Sharon,
Okay. How is Britain's withdrawal from the EU, the Brexit, how has that affected the border and the whole crisis of being divided?
How long do you have?
Colonial, that's bringing it back up, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Brexit was really interesting because I was saying to Kate earlier that I had a lot of friends who would, you know, they would still identify as like Irish, but they would also say that they're Northern Irish and they were kind of happy to be part of the UK because, like, well, it's a status quo and, you know, we're not doing too badly, so it's fine. And then after Brexit, I think for a lot of people, a lot of sort of middle class nationalists who maybe were happy with the status quo, they kind of realized that actually no, this isn't, all's not well. Like we really don't have sovereignty over, you know, our own borders for starters, but just, you know, lots of political decisions that do affect our lives. I mean, Brexit was really just a vote on you know, Britain becoming more insular, more racist, you know, enacting really like very, very restrictive border laws, which they are actually debating this week in the House of Commons with the nationality bill. I mean, there's talk of in the next few years they want to create a harder border, which means that, for example, a tourist from anywhere in the world, even a tourist in Europe from Europe who lands in Dublin Airport, they would have to get a special visa to travel up north. It's already, if you are someone who immigrates to Ireland, if you, for example, you are a non-European citizen and you move to Galway, if you want to visit Derry for a day, just, you know, to see it, in theory you need to apply for a visa. Now, before we had a soft border, like we currently still have a soft border, there are no checkpoints, so, you know, you should be okay, you won't get stopped. But the British government wants to change that because they want to close that border. And that's something that is, you know, I want to say, I don't need to tell you, but like that would be a disaster. Because what it means in reality is that they're making judgments on who they think looks Irish. You know, so people do now today get racially profiled on the border, despite the fact that there is no border. It's not like, you know, you have to pass through a checkpoint. There are no checkpoints. It's just the police on both sides of the border who are trained to say, well, you know, there are no. My mother is Spanish and has lived in Derry for, you know, 27 years, and she had to apply for settled status to the British government. So she had to apply for permission for the UK Home Office if she could stay on Irish land. And she's lucky because she's European. She, you know, owns her own house, is employed. But there's a lot of people who were refused settled status, and it's completely upended their lives because they're the wrong sort of immigrant. You know, so I think it's that kind of racism that is enforced and put into practice in Ireland, which we really don't want. That's one of many problems with Ireland.
Yeah, I have a question. In the 15-year struggle which you've summarized since around Bloody Sunday, did the Irish, either Republic or Six County trade unions play any role?
Yeah, they would have support from the local trade unions and the national trade unions as well, so much because they're now in coalition together from there you go. But they didn't, it took us a while to start with.
What about British trade unions?
I remember now, they probably didn't. But I remember at the start there was President Jerry Robinson who refused to get the Sunday families as well. And it was only when we protested outside our home in the Phoenix Park in Dublin that actually brilliant and gave us a hearing. We liked it as well. The Catholic Cardinal of Ireland at the time, Bishop Cahill Bailey, refused over and over again to engage at all with the Bloody Sunday family. actually, we wrote a letter to him for a meeting. He just wrote it back. The secretary wrote back, sorry, good luck, too busy. No, even when Bishop Daly, he was a hero until somebody intervened, he still refused to meet them. He was a very right-wing, pro-British sort of type of person anyway. But then obviously being generally people in Ireland that support us, and a certain number of Labour MPs, such as Jeremy Corbyn and stuff as well, and Ken Livingstone and Stephen Pound and stuff, certainly gave us a great lot of support in that. So that certainly we had decent support.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, what do you want to give us some concluding remarks? First, what?
Did you raise your hand?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I've already kind of mentioned this, but, there's still people in Ireland who would rather be ruled by the British, and so why is that? Why doesn't, that's, so there's still issues between people who want to be Ireland independent, those who want to, British is still want to think something.
Well, there's more in the north of Ireland. There's quite a large section, has like 50%, and they would be the sort of traditionally Protestant unionist, and they would identify as British because their ancestors would have come over from England and Scotland, and they, for all intents and purposes, like they are British. That's how they see themselves. So they are very glad to be a part of the United Kingdom, and they definitely see that as the culture that they buy into, and they have their own kind of culture and traditions. So that's why it's a bit of a complicated question, because I think in other sort of parts of the empire, like you don't really have British unionists in India or Jamaica, where they're like the descendants of colonizers or settlers. So it's a difficult one because we still want them to feel part of Ireland. It's just that I don't think everyone else should be forced to be part of Britain.
It's a bit unique to say there is two very polarised, one Catholic, one Protestant, and it's actually a Catholic majority. One of the majority of Catholics or whoever. There could be a referendum, and I think if I get a referendum once, you get it every 7 years. I think that's the way it is. So therefore, but you can understand the fears of 100 years ago about getting into a Catholic Ireland controlled by the church and stuff like that. That's no longer the case either, as we already covered. But you have to be in the mindset of the unionists to reiterate. And what is their fear about getting into a new Ireland? Now, it's not. There's a bit of reality coming in here with Brexit as well. Some of them are going, maybe we'll debate this, maybe we'll talk about New Ireland based on different principles and different sort of aspects of life, because it is a very right-wing run country as well. The whole civil service. People have to go to, if you don't have health insurance like here, you have to go and take care of your medical stuff and all that there. So I mean, it's the only advantage up north is a wee bit different in the sense of that, but the two identities are poles apart in terms of where they want to go. Because I certainly want to see you anything. What if they or not, I don't know. And it's been resisted for 800 or so many, or 100 years now. So, but the problem is it could be a Catholic majority for them, and it could be But I remember reading about what John Hume actually said when the gerrymandering of the electoral boundaries in Derry ended. It was about 50 years of a unionist gerrymandered council in Derry. When that ended, I think the first local government elections in 19.
And what the British did was they said, right, let's take an area where we can still maintain power. It started like 800 years ago or more, and it's taken all sorts of turns.
But it's still not settled.
It's still not settled. I mean, today,
Never been.
because we need to learn to coexist, and it's very complicated.
Still very, very polarized.
You're two.
You have an online question?
Go ahead.
Did you get one? Anyway, this is from somebody out of San
Every very decent criminal, whatever that means. So if loyalists, Republicans, and whatever were outside the prisons, trying to kill each other or whatever, how did they expect them to live, to coexist in prison together? They also called it normalisation. Northern Ireland's part of the UK, and it's normal. Nothing ever happened there. So all these prisoners be part of this normalised at the start. Musician. So that's. I hope that answers the question, but that's as much as I can.
Any other questions, or Paul?
Yeah, I heard the question before about how the question in Barbados about whether or not they wanted to be under the British Crown, which makes you British. I mean, if you're in the Commonwealth and under the British Crown, you are British. So that she has to pay to visit our family in Wolverhampton. But that just gets back to the question I was asking about, this ongoing question. And, you know, I think we were talking yesterday about Malcolm X, and we
We share a lot of the same culture. And I think that's something that I have come up against quite a bit, is people saying, you're so British, and the point is actually treat the rest of the Commonwealth equally. There's still very much that sense of Jamaica as a subject and as, not on an equal par with imperialism. But this very question, or interesting, the question of identity.
Anyway, people go to visit England from here, or live in England. I lived in England for years. Are you Protestant or Catholic?
From here,
You're Irish.
from Derry.
From Ireland, sorry. You're a Protestant or Catholic from the north of Ireland. If you go to England, you're Irish. Like, you're Irish.
yeah.
That's
So like a unionist in
I think this is Ireland.
is Irish. They're just seen as Irish, so that must be strange for them.
So when you travel, do you travel with a British passport? Or?
No.
Irish.
So I mean, we have the right to have British passports, but like I don't think either of us would ever take one. To be honest, I'd rather be stateless.
Yeah, right.
I'd rather go without a passport.
I see your point. Well, you have any concluding remarks for the meeting today?
Just keep going. Just keep doing what we're doing. I'm glad to be here eventually. So let's keep the ties and keep the bond between the two struggles. Again, one more and one struggle. So it's great to be here, and it's great to be beating these, and just we'll keep going. Hopefully.
So how long is the tour? How long will you be in the US?
Wednesday, Thursday, then I'm going to San Francisco. You're going to New York.
Okay.
You'll be speaking at the U of M Law School, correct? Or
On
something?
Monday.
Yeah. On April 4th, which is the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Right.
And when I get home, I'll send a link out
Yeah.
to the Google group. So if you want to watch.
Questions. It's great to meet you.
All right. Great.
Please come to Derry and come to the museum and introduce yourselves, please.
Okay.
By the way, I'm a big fan of Glasgow Celtic Football Club.
Yeah.
We're playing tomorrow, 12 o'clock in Scotland. 7 o'clock here.
Okay.
Working